As a reminder, points of view or opinions expressed herein do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Thank you, and as always, please reach out to the chat function or email bwctta@cna.org if you have any questions throughout this session or throughout the national meeting. Dr. White, I will turn it over to you at this point.
Okay, thanks, Bridget. This is Mike White from Arizona State University, TTA co-director. This session is going to build on some of the things I referred to in the last session, the 101 session, with regard to policy and the process for having your policy approved. I've got two esteemed colleagues who are going to help me with this session. Director Ali Cuevas, as well as Chief Harold Medlock, both of whom are TTA leads and work with sites on this process. So they have some kind of experiences and wisdom they can impart with regard to this. So I'm going to start off, and I want to talk a little bit about just why we think policy is important. I mentioned in that last session that policy is a kind of a foundational piece of this grant program. So I want to talk about why that is. I want to get into some of the specifics of one particular issue I think that many agencies struggle with, whether they're funded in this program or not, which is activation compliance, and then move into the scorecard process. And then at that point, I'll turn it over to Ali and Harold, and they can talk about their experiences. But let's start with just a little bit of background. Next slide, please, on the importance of policy generally. And you know, for the folks on this webinar, it probably is no surprise, you know, that we're suggesting that administrative policy is important, and it's important for police departments. You know, you've got policies on use of force, on pursuit, on any number of things, and you want those policies to work. And the same thing applies with body-worn camera policy. But what does it mean? What does it mean to have a policy that works? And to answer that question, I think you really got to think about the purpose of a policy. Whether it's use of force or body-worn cameras or whatever, the purpose of a policy is really to provide guidance for officers on that particular issue, and to control and guide decision-making. And that's what a good policy does. It provides guidance to officers with regard to whether it's use of force or foot pursuits or whatever it might be. And we've got about 50 years of research that tells us that administrative policy is important for police departments. But what that research also tells us is that there are some prereqs, that is, there's some requirements that have to be met beforehand if a policy is going to be successful, if it's going to be effective. And you see those three on this slide. If you want your policy to be effective, that is to successfully guide and control your officers' decision-making on a particular area, the first is that the policy has to be clear. So if you hand me, I'm one of your officers, you hand me a new policy, I need to be able to read it and to understand it and to know, okay, this is what's expected of me. This is not what is not expected of me. It has to be clear. The second pre-requirement is that it has to be known. You know, the policy has to be widely available. It has to be, hopefully there'll be some training involved, particularly if it's a brand new policy. I mean, think about what you might do if you have a fairly substantial change to your use of force policy, what you might do in terms of making sure that policy is known. Same thing would apply with a body-worn camera policy. And you know, I think hopefully that training is much more than a sergeant at a roll call handing out a written copy of it and saying, read it and tell me if you have any questions. We're talking about something more substantial in terms of making it known. And then the third prereq for a policy to be successful is that it has to be enforced. Compliance with the policy needs to be monitored. Again, think about what you do in your agency to monitor compliance with your use of force policy. And when we talk about compliance with a body-worn camera policy, we're going to talk about a couple of different things, but really, I think the area that receives the most attention is the activation decision. So these are the three important pieces to ensure that that if you're going to have a policy, that it is effective in accomplishing what you want it to accomplish, which is to provide guidance to officers to guide their decision making. Next slide, please. And as I said, this isn't new, and we're certainly not the first ones to talk about the importance of policy. I mean, think about CALIA, think about IACP, PERF, National Police Foundation. So there are any number of agencies that focus on the importance of administrative policy for police departments as a way, as I said, to guide and control officer decision making. And the areas where we've seen that this works effectively, assuming those three prereqs are met, are important areas. Deadly force, less lethal force, like use of the taser, particularly automobile pursuits and foot pursuits. So a wide range of areas where we've seen why, generally speaking, policy is important. And this is kind of the anchor for our focus on policy with this TTA program. We're linking our focus on policy to this larger body of research telling us that that administrative policy is indeed important. Next slide. I'm going to have a sip of coffee because it's still early here in Arizona. So let's transition a little bit to why we think body-worn camera policy is important. So certainly, as I just mentioned, you want your body-worn camera policy to guide officers' decision-making on any number of issues, from when they can review, when supervisors can review, when they have to activate, when they should not activate. So it guides officer decision-making. But, we look at body-worn camera policy really as a way to collaborate and show transparency and to communicate both internally and externally. Certainly, your policy is one way that you can communicate the goals of your body-worn camera program. You get to tell your officers and other folks in the policy why you've done this, why you've adopted body-worn cameras. You're certainly going to convey your expectations to officers with regard to the, any number of issues related to body-worn cameras. But again, I think the collaboration and transparency pieces the importance of those cannot be overstated. If you go through this policy development process, you have the opportunity to engage in communication with and collaboration with a lot of important units in your department, especially the union. You want them on board and involved in the policy development process. IT, other agencies, internal affairs, whoever you deem that should be involved. And then also externally. I know a number of agencies that have shared their draft policy with the prosecutor's office, with the public defender, with local advocacy groups like the ACLU. And again, that gets to the transparency piece too, both internally and externally. And I mentioned guiding officer decision, but think about that last one on the bottom, providing a foundation for accountability. And that goes back to that third prereq for an effective policy, is that you're going to monitor compliance with the policy. So you want to make sure your policy conveys to officers, like I said, what is expected of them. And then you need to be thinking about, okay, are officers following policy? How are we going to know that? How are we going to determine that? How are we going to assess that on a regular basis? And more importantly, what are we going to do if we find officers are not following policy? Next slide, please. And I want to focus in on that last point, the monitoring of compliance, because you've adopted body-worn cameras in your department for any number of reasons. Maybe because of the evidentiary value, maybe you want to show transparency, maybe you want to reduce complaints against your officers. And both this morning in the one-on-one session and the session that's happening now, what you'll hear is that actually the session, not this one, but the one that's competing with us, that's being recorded and you can listen to later. You'll hear that body-worn cameras have a lot of promise in these areas, in delivering on the promise and producing positive outcomes. But the bottom line is that all of the benefits of body-worn cameras are short-circuited if officers do not comply with policy. So I want to focus more on this particular issue. Next slide, please. And the area, like I said, there could be any number of areas you focus on when you're monitoring officers' compliance with body-worn camera policy. It could be supervisory review. It could be sharing of videos. It could be any number of things, but I think the area or the issue that has received the most attention and has been quite controversial in some cases is the activation decision, particularly if you have a critical incident where there should have been a recording and there wasn't one. And there have been a number of studies that have focused on this question of activation. And I want to go over some of these studies because I think they're important, because what they do is they link compliance with the activation part of the policy to some of the key outcomes that you're focused on, like use of force and reduction in complaints. So I'll get into some of these studies. So next slide, please. One of the, I think the study and agency that first looked at this important issue of activation compliance was Phoenix. And it was a study that was conducted back in 2013. So this is quite a while ago. Phoenix was an early adopter, and through their foresight with their researcher Chuck Katz at ASU, who's on our team as well, they looked at activation compliance. So what you're seeing on this slide is by month for the officers that had cameras, how often they complied with the policy on activation. And you can see it's not great. In May of 13, it peaked at 42%. Over the entire study period, activation compliance was about 30%, which means 70% of the time when there should have been an activation, there wasn't one. And that's a problem. And that's not an effective policy. And if you go, Phoenix has been working on this ever since then. And it turns out, I think the area where they, for a variety of reasons, where they fell short was in that third prereq, the monitoring of compliance, and then the follow-up, the accountability piece, addressing and dealing with officers who have low activation rates. Next slide. And that original ASU study of Phoenix also looked at it by call type. And you can see domestic violence had the highest activation compliance rate, but still quite low. And you can see how it drops off. And as I said, Phoenix has been deploying cameras. I think the initial deployment was only about 50 officers. They're a large department. They've deployed many more cameras and have been very, very focused on activation compliance and have gotten it up quite a bit higher. Next slide. Another department in Arizona that did an interesting early study was the Mesa Police Department. They did a one-year study, and they started off with a very restrictive activation statement. You shall record, and basically officers were required to record just about everything. And after 6 months, they moved to what they said was a kind of a less restrictive policy, gave officers more discretion on when to activate. And then at the end of the year, they went back, and what they saw is when they moved to that less restrictive policy, activations had dropped substantially. It dropped by more than 40%. So again, the link between policy and officer behavior in terms of activation. The Hedberg study looked at the Phoenix data, and using some fancy statistics, they projected out what would have happened to complaints against officers if compliance had been higher. And they were able to demonstrate that if activation compliance had been at or near 100%, almost all complaints against officers would have been eliminated. And then the aerial study, I think, is really important because it goes to one of those core outcomes that many agencies seek to achieve when deploying cameras, which is reductions in use of force. And what the aerial study did is it linked compliance with policy to that outcome. So for example, they found in cases or in incidents where officers followed policy, they activated when they were supposed to, they notified citizens of the camera, use of force declined by 37%. Compare that to incidents where officers did not follow policy. They didn't activate and or they didn't notify the citizen. And in those encounters, use of force actually increased by more than 70%. So again, I think these demonstrate the importance of that third part, that third prereq, which is monitoring compliance with with your body-worn camera policy, in this case with activation, because what we're seeing as the research is linking compliance with activation to some of those important outcomes that we'd like to achieve. Okay, next slide. I think the other important piece to keep in mind if you're getting ready to deploy cameras is that you might see quite a bit of variation in compliance rates within your department. So this is a figure from a study with the Anaheim, California Police Department, and don't worry about the colors. What you're seeing here, each of the dots on this graph represents one officer. And if you look along the bottom, you can see the number of officers. So overall, there were about 40 officers in this study, so pretty small. And what you're seeing is the activation rate, compliance rate for each officer. And you'll see some of the officers in the far left bottom. Those are officers that had very, very low activation rates, almost zero. So these are officers who were hardly ever activating their camera. And then you had some officers on the other end who were activating more than 60% of the time. So I think this is important to recognize, because it demonstrates that I think you're going to, especially at the start, you're going to see some variation in activation compliance, and you're going to want to, if you're thinking about that third prereq, you're going to want to focus in on the officers with those low rates and try to get those rates up. Next slide. And I say that you can expect this because when I saw that study in Anaheim, I was working with the Spokane Police Department. I thought that was a pretty cool way to look at it. And I went and I did the same exact thing. And guess what I saw? The same exact thing. I had more officers in my study, so I had more dots on the graph. But again, the same thing. A chunk of officers down who are activating very rarely, and some in this particular study who were over 70% in terms of activation compliance. And we've heard a lot about flattening curves recently. This is a curve that you would want to flatten, and you want to flatten it up around the 70 or 80% range where officers are activating at higher rates, and you're reducing some of that variation, and you're working with the officers who are down at the other end who are not activating a lot. Okay, next slide. And here's a good example of flattening that curve. This is the New Orleans Police Department, and you can see if you look at their activation compliance, you see really, really high compliance, upwards of 95% almost every month. So this is a demonstration that you can get that high level of compliance. I will say there's some important context here, and that context is that New Orleans at this time was under a consent decree. They had a federal judge who was very, very focused on activation compliance. So there was a pretty big hammer for the department in terms of working with officers to make sure that compliance was happening. So that's just a little bit of the background I wanted to provide, both on the importance of policy and then also the importance of monitoring compliance with policy, particularly with the activation piece. What I want to do next is just provide a little bit more detail. If we go to the next slide, a little more detail on the policy review process that many of you have started to go through already. I'll provide some discussion of the kind of the nuts and bolts of it and how it works and why it works the way it does. And then I'll turn it over to Ali and to Harold, and they can talk about some of the experiences, some of the do's and don'ts that they've witnessed. So you heard David Lewis this morning talking about the importance of this process. It's tied to your funds. Your access to your funds is contingent on you passing through this process. You can access 10% of your funds immediately, but guess what? You're not going to get access to the other 90% until you work with your TTA lead and get through this process. And I will tell you that there are two avenues to go through or to choose from. I'm going to talk at length about the policy review process itself. But for the agencies that have been funded before and who've gone through this process before, or an agency that's been doing this for a while and has a good policy, there's a separate certification process, which I'll refer to in a minute, which is just an expedited way to get through this process. But if you're just getting started, this is the process that you want to go through. And as I mentioned in the last session, it's It's not adversarial. You work with your TTA lead, whether it's Harold or Ollie or somebody else, and they're going to work with you to take your policy, your draft policy, to score it on the scorecard, to assess the comprehensiveness. And then if, like I said previously, if there's some areas that are falling short, to work with you to make sure those gaps are filled. And once the scorecard is complete, those mandatory items are met, then the scorecard is verified and BJA releases the remainder of your funds. So again, this is not an adversarial process. Look at your TTA lead as someone who's supportive, who can help you get through this process. Okay, next slide. I mentioned this, the scorecard in the last session. It's an Excel spreadsheet. It's not fancy. We've been using it for 5 years now. It's been tweaked over the years to be a little more efficient. But again, the idea is that you work with your TTA lead to make sure all the bases are covered. And like what I said before, you're seeing the policy development section here, and it's basically a yes or no. You have to hit those 13 mandatory items. Those are the most critical. The non-mandatory, it's up to you. The recommendations for us for things to think about, but really it's the mandatory ones that are most important. And again, the point that I highlighted in the previous section is we're only looking at the comprehensiveness here. You will not hear from CNA, from BJA, any specific direction on language. There's no prescriptiveness. You decide locally, working with your internal units, your internal folks, your community, whoever else you deem necessary, to determine the specifics of the language on your policy on these issues. So that part is up to you. And again, that's why we see that variation. But the idea here is to make sure that that all of the bases are covered. Next slide. I mentioned the certification process. And we created this because we had a number of agencies that were being funded for a second time. And it just seemed kind of silly to make an agency that had already gone through this process once to have to do it again. And then also we've had some agencies get funds, and they've been doing this for a while. They've had a body-worn camera program for several years. They've had a good policy. The idea was to create a more efficient process for those more seasoned agencies. And so basically the certification process, you work with your TTA lead, but essentially what you're doing is you're looking at the scorecard, you're looking at your policy, and you are certifying to BJA that the mandatory issues in the scorecard are all covered in your policy, and you sign off on it. And like I said, it's a more efficient way to get through this process. Next slide. Keep in mind what I had mentioned a couple of minutes ago when I started, that body of research on the importance of administrative policy, on use of force, on pursuits, on any number of things. That's the anchor for this. All of that 50 years or so worth of research. We believe that if you have a good body-worn camera policy that covers all of these 9 areas, all the 36 specific issues, that good body-worn camera policy will then generate good body-worn camera practice. And you know, we feel pretty confident in that statement, and that's why policy is such an important part of this grant program. Okay, next slide. Because, as I said, it's not prescriptive, it's not directional, we see a lot of variation in how agencies deal with some pretty important issues like activation, like citizen notification, like when officers can review. So what we've done is over each year we do a policy analysis. We'll do another one this fall. The most recent one you see here, you can click on the link below and you'll get the actual report. Over 300 policies. I have read way too many body-worn camera policies in my lifetime. But that does give me and some of our other folks here on the TTA team a really good sense of what those key trends are. And so what I thought I would do is just give you a little bit of a teaser and talk about two specific issues. And then if you're interested, you can go and look at some of the others that are described. So let's look at the first one. Next slide. And the first one is, well, those are the 10 specific issues that we look at in the report. You know, some of these we've been looking at for a long time. Some we've added along the way. So if you remember the Stephen Clark incident with Sacramento, the muting of the body-worn cameras after the officer-involved shooting. At that point, we thought, well, geez, why don't we take a look at muting? So we went back and we added that. And then activation during public demonstrations. Obviously, that's one that has been getting a lot of attention recently. So some of these we've looked at for a long time. Some we've been added along the way. But next slide. What I wanted to do, as I said, is let's just take a look at two issues just to give you a little bit of a taste of what this report does. And I'll use, as I said, citizen notification as the first example. And so what we've seen is that there are really three different options to choose from when thinking about what you want your policy to say on citizen notification. The first is to have some sort of mandatory language. And what you see under each of these options is actual policy language that we took from an agency. But if you have mandatory language, it's something like what you see here. You have the shall, where members shall inform all individuals identified be present. You got to tell them that they're being recorded. The second option is that you recommend it. So you tell officers in your policy that that they should perhaps, or that it's a good idea to let people know that they're being recorded, but it's not required. And then the third option is you have some sort of statement that simply says officers are not required to advise citizens they're being recorded. So those are the three options that we've seen. Next slide. What we do then is, you know, we go and we look and we see what agencies are saying with regard to this specific issue of citizen notification. And you can see we do it by year. And so, for example, most agencies do not mandate the notification. They do not require it. You can see the breakdown by year, but overall it's only about 20% mandating the notification, saying it is required. And a lot of this is driven by state law. The remainder of the 80% that are not mandating split fairly evenly into the other two categories, with about 40% recommending and about 40% having that statement that simply says officers are not required to notify. So that's one example of how the policy analysis looks at a specific issue. And we're not making any recommendations here about what you should say. We're just showing you what the trends are among the 300 plus agencies that had been examined for this report. Next slide. The other example I wanted to use to demonstrate the report, or what's in the report, is officer authority to review. So when can your officers look at their own video? And there are two different issues at play here. And the first is not that controversial, although some are opposed to it. I call it routine review. So are your officers permitted, say at the end of the shift as they're completing reports, are they permitted to go back and look at video to help fill out the reports to refresh their memory? So that kind of routine review. The second issue, which is much more controversial, is what happens after a critical incident, what happens after an officer-involved shooting. And the issues at play here are the sequence of events with regard to making a statement and viewing the video, which can come first. Next slide. Let's deal with the first issue, the officer authority to review for kind of that routine report writing. So that's number one, and you can see by year, the vast majority of agencies that have been funded in this program allow that kind of routine day-to-day access of video for report writing. Although you can see in the last year that we looked at, it had dropped off a little bit. But again, most agencies are permitting officers to do that, refresh their memory as they complete the reports. What about the second issue, the one that's much more controversial. When you have that critical incident, when you have that shooting, what do departments say with regard to the sequence of events in terms of viewing video and making that initial statement? Around 10% require the officer to give a statement first before viewing the video. So what that means is the vast majority of agencies funded in this grant program allow their officers to look at the video of the incident before making a formal statement. Now, this is an area, and I've heard the arguments on both sides. In particular, the psych memory researchers are very much opposed to viewing the video first, but there's good arguments on both sides. Again, we're not taking a position, we're just showing you where most of the agencies are coming down on a specific issue. And in this case, it is in fact allowing officers to view the video first before making a statement. Next slide. A couple of things final things before I turn it over to Ollie and Harold. I will say that we just completed a report a few months ago where we did this same exact policy analysis, but we broke down the agencies by size, and you can see the different size categories. And essentially what we wanted to do, we wanted to see if size mattered. The agencies vary based on size in terms of how they handle some of these policy issues. And for the most part, the answer is no. There were some clear differences in policy positions, but it didn't really relate to agency size. So there would be some cases where, the small and the large agencies would be aligned and the medium would be the outlier. But so there would be differences, but it really didn't relate to size. But what this does is if you're an extra small agency or a large agency or whatever, you can go in and you can see what some of the other agencies who are similar to you in size are doing on specific issues. And I will say when there were when there was an outlier, it tended to be those extra small agencies. And again, this report's available for you to take a look at. So next slide. A couple of final notes before I turn it over to my colleagues. Obviously, our position is there's no one-size-fits-all policy. That's why this isn't prescriptive or directional. The specifics of the language are determined by you and by your agency and by your other stakeholders. I think one of the other important pieces to keep in mind, really important pieces, is that your program's going to change over time, your body-worn camera program, and so is your policy. Policies are not static. They need to be updated, they need to be reviewed, and that's normal, and that should happen. And certainly one of the areas where you could see some need for change is based on what your state legislative bodies are up to. David Lewis mentioned this in the initial session. A lot of legislative bodies are passing laws with regard to police reform, and in some cases, some of the key aspects of police body-worn cameras are being addressed in those laws, and you need to pay attention to that. We have a link here for the Urban Institute has a state policy tracker, which is really, really useful. They keep it up to date. So you click on that and you go to your particular state and you can see what the latest and greatest is in terms of body-worn camera policy. But the idea is policy is going to change. That's normal. That's good. And you want to stay up to date with the latest and greatest. So I think that's all from me. I'll turn it over now to, I think Ollie's going to go first and talk about some of his experiences with this process.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just a quick word. My name's Orlando Cuevas. I'm the director of the Regional Police Academy in New Jersey. I'm a retired assistant chief from Camden County, New Jersey. And I'd like to talk a little bit in relation to the scorecard, my experience. And, I come from an agency, police agency that was originally mired in corruption and mistrust. And, over the course of several years, we worked hard to build trust back with our community. And when we started to run across body cameras, we knew that they would be very important to us working our way back to gaining the community's trust. Never really fully appreciating or expecting the value, the full value that they had for us, particularly when it came to preaching our message or getting our message out to the community, and then also with things like officer training. You know, we're going to talk about some requirements of the policy scorecard, but I think that one of the issues that sometimes goes kind of underrepresented is the notion of training and how beneficial they can be for training. And more important than all the gotchas in the world are the training values and the corrections and how we can better serve our officers by making them better as they do their job. So, you know, I'm going to start off talking about the first portion of the scorecard. Chief Medlock and I we figured we would go over the mandatory objectives and then hopefully have a couple of minutes for questions about any of the other objectives. So I'm going to start off talking about the first few objectives, particularly the ones that deal with best practices and working with internal agency perspectives and why that's so important. When we started our process in Camden, I didn't fully appreciate the value of working with, we worked with a educational partner who helped us appreciate the value of looking to our internal agency perspectives to include not only just officers from different segments of the agency, but officers from the union down to supervisors, IT, records, just a very broad scope of inclusion. You know, what this did for us is that it helped us not only with stakeholder buy-in, officers could, you know, they could actually provide some good insight. And, you know, sometimes when we discuss this, you know, line 13 on the scorecard, internal agency perspective, some agencies think that means that, you know, the union or some other group of the agency is going to tell the chief what the policy should write, and nothing could be farther from the case. But more times than not, they bring forward some really, really good ideas and recommendations, and then certainly you have that buy-in. Line 14 talks about the external criminal justice stakeholders, and then you know, obviously that's a great practice to include them. Folks like the prosecutor's office, defense attorneys, the local court systems. Find that this is very important, obviously, to you know, when you start dealing not only with you know, evidentiary issues, but local requirements. Here in New Jersey, we have a lot of Attorney General guidelines, directives that are mandatory that come down from the Attorney General's office. But the trend over the last few years also has been that prosecutors in each county have provided extra guidance to police agencies in New Jersey. So we think it's really important to include them, and certainly to also include them as part of the stakeholder buy-in. There are many reasons for this. Obviously, it's a mandatory objective, but clearly, when you go through the process, you can see the benefit of including a prosecutor, not only to look at things like such as redactions and evidence and how they're handled, but also, you know, consider ways when you go through this, ways in which you can partner with the prosecutor or the DA and kind of see if you can get help with some of those with some of those responsibilities that could result in monumental costs for the agency. Sometimes you can pass it off, and the prosecutor's office or DA will be happy to do a redaction. So these are things you want to think through, why they're beneficial, you know, and certainly doing them prior to deploying your project certainly will help you and reap much benefit. Line 15 talks about community and advocacy groups and were they made aware of your decision to deploy. Many agencies fulfill this objective in different ways. I've seen folks have a sit down with neighborhood groups or meet with several neighborhood groups. I've seen some agencies post it on their social media sites. Some have a very broad campaign. Unfortunately, this is the one objective I see that creates some concern for agencies and sometimes becomes the hardest to fulfill, although it probably should be one of the easier ones because I find that most agencies are doing these things, but really just illustrating this, how you communicate with your community and how you communicate your projects outward, and certainly body cameras are one of those beneficial projects that you want to communicate outward. Line 17 talks about whether or not you consider state mandates, and clearly this is important. New Jersey is a prime example. Not only do we have a lot of Attorney General directives dealing with body cameras, but we're expecting many legal changes, as are many other states, in light of all the social justice reform issues that are whirling around throughout the country. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Medlock and ask him to introduce himself and also to help me go through some of these mandatory objectives in the scorecard.
Thanks, Ollie. Folks, I'm Harold Medlock. I am a retired chief from North Carolina. Spent 4 years as police chief in Fayetteville, North Carolina, the Fayetteville Police Department, and 25 years with Charlotte Mecklenburg Police, and was very instrumental in working with CMPD when we developed our in-car camera program, and took over a department in 2012 in Fayetteville that did not have a lot of trust, as Ollie shared with his department, and just some real relationship issues with our community. So early in my time there, I had determined that we were going to find a way to implement the body-worn camera program. We just did not have the money to do it, and luckily, our department was one of the first in 2015 who were able to take advantage of this body-worn camera program. So thanks to BJA and NIJ for working with us and trusting us early in the process. You know, a couple of things that I've learned over the last 4 years of working with departments as they have worked through this body-worn camera policy is that it's very, very easy to overgeneralize. And then the other thing that I will share with you is this. It is really easy for us to work with most police departments and sheriff's offices because these organizations are what I would consider very high functioning organizations who will not take anything less than 100%. And so when we say that there's a minimum of a few mandatories, the bottom line is the departments that I've been associated with and worked with have striven to achieve 100%. Many of them have, and that's again their choice, but it's really rewarding to see. A couple of things that I want to share with you that I've learned in working over the last few years. Some of the categories, and again, speaking to overgeneralization, line 19 asks, does the policy specify who's assigned or permitted to wear body-worn cameras? And our first conversations generally with the department that is going to implement this program is, well, everyone in patrol is going to be assigned a body-worn camera. And then that makes it really easy. So that would be their statement and their policy, which is certainly acceptable. But when you start asking the questions of, now when you say everyone in patrol, does that mean your officers, your deputies, your corporals, your sergeants, your lieutenants, your captains, and then if there is a deputy chief or a major in charge of patrol, are they going to wear a body-worn camera as well? And immediately the departments will put the brakes on and say, well, wait a minute, we're really talking about officers and deputies and supervisors. And so, okay, now we can begin to narrow that down and talk about what that means as everyone in patrol. So we talk about those people that are assigned to patrol as patrol duties, and then at what rank? Is it a corporal and a supervisor, or is it simply the officers and deputies? So again, having those conversations to help narrow down what your intention is as a department. The other question is, and often we have departments who have said we're going to assign also with patrol all of our detectives. And again, the question would be, okay, that's fine, but when will those detectives wear that body-worn camera? When they're vested up to go out and do a field interview, or do you expect them to wear them, with their coat and tie or professional dress while they're in the office? Finally, are bailiffs and courtroom security, if you're a sheriff's office, are they going to be required, or is there an expectation that they would wear the body-worn cameras in the courtroom? And if so, as Ollie pointed out, has anyone checked with the judges, the bar and the judges in your jurisdiction, to make sure that the judges are okay with that? And then again, finally, if your SROs are or are not assigned to patrol, is your expectation through this program and through the grant to equip your SROs? If so, then those folks need to be designated as well. So you work through those, we have these conversations, and then the natural follow on to that is, while it's not a mandatory, is So does your policy or will your policy address wearing of body-worn cameras during off-duty assignments? And frequently we get a pause on the phone in the interview, and we get this, well, gee, we didn't think about that. And so then the question is, are you issuing the body-worn cameras on a one-for-one or per officer basis, or are they going to hot seat the cameras, which is going to restrict or eliminate the ability for an officer to perhaps keep one or wear it during an off-duty assignment? More importantly, are there some off-duty assignments that you're more concerned about your people wearing versus another? And again, just those questions that the conversation allows the department to really start to narrow down or focus on those things that are important for those particular categories. Ollie, I'm going to cover one more and I'll kick it back over to you. Line 24 asks, does the policy specify when officers are to activate the body-worn camera? Well, that's an easy one. They're going to activate the body-worn camera when they show up to a call. Well, is that the most appropriate time, or do you want to have them, when the call is dispatched, go ahead and activate that body-worn camera as part of their muscle memory, which then also covers their movement, their vehicle movement to the call for service, and again, then they don't have to worry about activation, pardon me, when they step out of the car. Do you want your officers to activate the camera during emergency response, and then vehicle pursuits or foot pursuits? Those are things that should be specified to your officers in your policy. We don't care, as Mike said, we don't care what you say. We just want you to have a solid policy that your deputies, your officers on midnight shift or on Saturday morning can pull up in their car or pull that policy out and say, well, wait a minute, I'm not clear about how this works. And then they have that in front of them that they can refer to. And then finally, as it relates to activation, deactivation, it comes to victims or witness interviews. Now, I'm pretty sensitive to, that's going to surprise some of you because nobody thinks I'm sensitive, but I am actually sensitive to when and how body-worn cameras are used when people are being interviewed. And I call your attention to a sex assault victim or a domestic violence victim, children, or interactions, just general interactions with juveniles. You know, we have to think through that and again, decide for yourself. Your department decides for yourself what that looks like. And it runs the gamut from we're always going to keep the camera on to we're going to keep the camera on and turn away from the victim so that we don't show them, but we get the interview recorded, to we're going to leave it to the officer's discretion, and then to finally the officer has to have supervisory approval. So again, it doesn't matter to the scoring team. It doesn't matter to Dr. White and the team who review these, and finally to BJA. We just want to make sure that you have the strongest, most solid policy that your officers and your deputies can follow all the time. Ollie, I'll give it back to you.
Sure. Great points, Chief. It really gave me pause for one thought, particularly in line 20 when you talked about who's assigned and permitted. I think it's important. I've dealt with some agencies. What I find that most are understanding why this is so important. I've dealt with some agencies who feel that maybe it's best to not answer this question. And I just like to throw it out there that I would recommend that, I think Dr. White did a very, very good job of explaining why policy is so important. But if we don't codify those things in policy, I would assume that could result in mistrust as opposed to, the public assuming that we didn't assign names specifically, for a genuine reason. So just so I want to throw that out there. But moving on to line 27. We talk about citizen notification. Dr. White covered that very well, so I don't think I can add much to it, except to say that I think it's very important to consider documentation and narration. So it gives officers opportunity in policy, to narrate their notifications. So whether or not, how are they going to notify people when they're doing it? Just some considerations and policies that you can narrate these reasons, and then also, have the officer use those other forms to document that they gave notification. Some states require it, like we do, like we have here in New Jersey. You're required in most cases to give notification, particularly when someone asks you. So just consideration. I'll kick it back to Chief Melbach at this point for the next one in the interest of time.
Thanks, Ollie. So again, moving through some of the ones that have created more discussion than others. Really, the guidance on citizen requests for non-recording or body-worn camera deactivation. I love that one because we'll have departments, and we do have departments that simply say, no matter what the citizen asks, we're going to continue to record. And so, as you can imagine, to Dr. White's earlier point, in notification on immediate or initial interaction with someone, notifying them, we have departments that say, well, I don't want to notify because that automatically puts me at an adversarial relationship. And the fact is, if we're on a traffic stop, that is an adversarial relationship right off the bat. So again, just notifying someone that you are or are not activating or you're recording it shouldn't put it to too much into an adversarial relationship. But again, getting back to the citizen request for deactivation, I go back to, no matter what your policy says, direct them to it in the policy. So you can, again, simply say, we are going to keep the camera on any time that we are engaged with the public in an enforcement activity. What this does is allow the officer or the deputy to say, when that request is made, gee, I'm sorry, but policy says that I have to keep my camera on all the time when I'm engaged in an interaction such as this with the public. And so most people will say, okay, well, if policy says it, I can't argue with that. And usually that will suffice. I don't know how many times in my career I used, as I was putting handcuffs on someone and taking them to jail for a routine arrest, whatever a routine arrest means these days, but a compliant person putting them in the back of my car, handcuffed behind their back, and they would say, can't you handcuff me in front of my body, or do you have to put the handcuffs on? And my response always was, gee, I'm sorry, but that's department policy. I have to do that when I'm transporting someone in the back of my car. So again, a solid policy that says, we're going to do this all the time the same way is very, very helpful to your officers and to your deputies. Ollie, I'll just jump to 41 if I can and kick it back to you. This is a mandatory. And again, does the policy specify authority of the officer to review body-worn camera footage he or she recorded under routine circumstances? And again, that's the routine traffic stops. It may be the DV call that you and your partner just went on. You're trying to complete that report. You're back in, the officers or deputies back in their car. They're knocking that report out, and they forgot exactly what someone said. So, is the department going to allow that officer or deputy to go back and look at that camera footage to then put that in their statement? And then the other thing that the body-worn camera policy as a follow-on asks is, in that case, does it specify authority of other officers to review each other's body-worn camera footage? And again, I'll use the domestic violence scenario where your partner is talking to one spouse in the kitchen, you're talking to them just out of earsight, but certainly within each other's eyesight, and each are giving statements. Are you going to allow your officers, as they have cleared that call and completing their reports, their statements, to view one another's body-worn camera footage? Giving that clear, concise direction is going to help them feel comfortable with what they're allowed to do, not for entertainment purposes, but simply for completing those necessary reports. And then as Dr. White shared earlier, then you get into the uses of force and the internal investigations and having clear language for that. Ollie?
All right, so if we could just go back to line 36, the question is, does the policy provide guidance on process requirements or data and footage download? Yeah, very important one. I think most people understand why. You don't want evidence, a body camera to sit out at its docking station for a couple days and have the possibility of missing evidence. I think it's clear that it sounds much better that we can immediately download these things at the end of a shift or sometime close to that and transfer the information to avoid any potential of corrupted information. But one of the things I think we have to talk about that we perhaps don't consider as much when we're dealing with this objective is not only when it should be downloaded, but also the who's are responsible and in what situations. For instance, if an officer is involved in a shooting, if the officer is involved in an accident, how's that information going to be handled? Do officers share video cameras, or is the primary recording officer responsible to dock and download the device him or herself? Very important considerations, because now you're talking about chain of custody and chain of custody issues, and oftentimes in court, a good defense attorney has a higher priority and sometimes causing, creating an air of uncertainty rather than, proving that any officer did something wrong. He's just out to prove just some level of questionable information to help the defendant. So very important consideration. Please keep those in mind. Next, we'll go to line 44, I believe it is. Yes, line 44. Does the policy address supervisory review of BWC footage for administrative investigations? I think one of the things that we see here is that most agencies intend to apply that right to supervisors. However, they don't do it explicitly in policy. And this can be important for many reasons. First of all, clearly you need to think through the process. Is this what we want supervisors doing, and to what extent? Clearly unions have issues with officers. Sometimes there's a misunderstanding about what supervisors can review and how random they can review. Some agencies have met the union somewhere in the middle by limiting review by supervisor unless there's a specific context, meaning that there's a violation, such as these administrative investigations. Some agencies are, whether they're under consent decree or any other requirement, they transfer that function to an internal affairs function. So we talk about administrative functions. We're not talking about criminal acts. We're talking about all those types of things that are rule and policy violations within an agency. So best to codify them and just to make it clear once again for everyone's sake, and just have a good understanding of policy for all in the agency. Chief, do you have any thoughts about that before we move on?
No, Ollie. Just to your point, practice or custom in a department will eat policy for lunch, and again, having that solid direction to your officers, to your deputies, and to your command level folks is critical.
All right. I think the last two are talking about training requirements, and I think one of the ones I find to be most important is line 62. Talking about periodic review. I'd like to end it on this note by just talking about how important I think this is. It's often estimated as a process, because what your policy is going to look like a year from the day you start is clearly going to be different. The technology is going to change. The perspective of many are going to change. Dr. White talked about compliance. That ebbs and flows, and sometimes as an agency moves forward, sometimes you can dial back compliance, or sometimes if it's moving in a different direction, you may have to dial that up. So I recommend at the end of a period, a lot of agencies will do 1 year for a periodic review of the policy and program, but that's not required. Just required that you do it at an interval. But it's definitely good to look at it and recommend that you go into your word search and look at the shalls and the shoulds and kind of figure out if they need to change to the alternative. That's all I have. Thank you very much. Dr. White.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie and Harold, for some real important insights on the process and the importance of some of those specific issues. We're just about out of time. I did want to raise a few points that came up in the chat box. It turns out, we continually learn. I got a message from one of our colleagues at CNA. CNA also has a state legislative tracker. So, we've got our own. So send an email to your TTA lead. Apparently it's not publicly available, but we can share it with grantees. So that's in addition to what the Urban Institute has, which may be a little bit out of date. There was a separate question on whether or not BJA provides any review and feedback with regard to policy. And I think the short answer is no. They rely on the TTA provider, us, to take agencies through that process, and beyond that, they don't provide any feedback. I will tell you, there are multiple stages. So you work with your TTA lead, and then it goes to the next level, which is review by myself. I review every single scorecard, and one other person does as well. And then we send it to BJA with a recommendation. So that's the multi-stage process. There was also a question about the issue of when officers can review the footage in a critical incident, whether it's before or after they make a statement. And the question was, what's the rationale for not allowing officers to review it first? So, I think the issue really is, and one of our colleagues chimed in too, is if you're going to require the statement first before reviewing the video, so you can get that kind of unadulterated memory of what happened. And I mentioned memory researchers. There are a bunch of psychologists who study memory and who, that research demonstrates quite clearly when you review something, it affects, subconsciously or not, your memory of the incident. So the primary rationale of doing the statement first is to get the officer's recollection of what happened before it's perhaps affected by what he or she might see in the video. So I think that was all the questions. I'll kick it over to Bridget for some final words.
Yes, thank you, Dr. White.